In 1840, a young boy named Booker Webster witnessed a scene that would stay with him for life. He had been taken captive by the Comanche a few seasons prior, learning their language and becoming a part of their world. But on this day something shifted. Members of the tribe were wailing in grief, mourning the loss of several leaders who had been killed in what they viewed as a great betrayal. During a council meeting with the Texans, the cries grew louder, and Booker observed the men cutting off their sacred hair, a symbol of deep sorrow among the Comanche. Meanwhile, the women, in a display of their anguish, took knives to their arms and legs, slicing their skin in a ritualistic expression of grief. But this mourning was just the beginning. Anger quickly replaced their sorrow, and Booker watched in horror as preparations for a darker ritual began. Fires were built and stakes were prepared. He understood what was coming. Though Booker was spared, his Comanche mother had adopted and protected him. Other white captives, mostly women and children, were not so fortunate. The captives were subjected to unimaginable tortures, not by the Comanche warriors, as one might expect, but by the women. The Comanche women, often overshadowed by the men's reputation for brutality, were in many cases even more vicious. Comanche women had a hard life, arguably tougher than the warriors. While they didn't carry the same social status as the men, their roles were vital for the tribe's survival. Practically everything outside of war, hunting and weapon making, fell to the women. Clothing, tools and housing were all their responsibility. It's said that a Comanche woman could set up a teepee in just 15 minutes and take it down in 5, preparing it for transport on horseback. Given their nomadic lifestyle, this efficiency was essential as the tribe moved across the Great Plains. When the men returned from a hunt, it was the women who skinned the animals, dried the meat, and tanned the hides. Their workload increased when buffalo hides became a hot commodity in trade during the 1800s, bringing greater wealth to the tribe and encouraging men to take on multiple wives. In this polygamous society, the more work a woman could do, the more valuable she was. Comanche women were known for their practicality. Unlike the men, who cherished their long hair as a symbol of status, the women had no such attachments. They often kept their hair short for convenience and to minimize lice and ticks, while the men painted their faces in black for war. Representing death, the women used brighter, more vivid colors like reds and yellows. This was just one way in which they differentiated themselves, though. They shared in the same fierce spirit that defined their people. Despite their smaller stature, many Comanche women were under 5 feet tall. They were as tough as they come. They weren't warriors by design, but they were expert riders and archers. In a culture constantly under threat, they had to be able to defend themselves and their families. When Comanche camps were attacked by outsiders, it was not uncommon for women to fight just as fiercely as the men. Some accounts from Texas Rangers and U.S. soldiers describe how Comanche women fought to the death, blurring the line between warrior and non. These women knew what awaited them if they were captured: slavery, abuse, or worse, so surrender was never an option. The women's strength extended beyond the battlefield. They played a crucial role in encouraging raids, and when warriors returned with captives, it was often the women who meted out the punishment. In many cases this meant torture, as Booker Webster had witnessed. However, not all captives were killed. Some, like Booker, were adopted into the tribe, though this came with its own risks, especially for female captives who were seen as rivals by Comanche women. Establishing dominance within the tribe could be brutal, as was the case with many captives like Matilda Lockhart and Rachel Plummer. Matilda Lockhart was captured at 14 and endured horrific abuse at the hands of the Comanche women. By the time she was returned to the Texans in 1840, she was unrecognizable. Her nose had been burnt off, and her feet had been burned to prevent her from escaping. These acts of cruelty were commonplace for the Comanche, seen as a way of reinforcing social hierarchy within the tribe. Rachel Plummer's story is another chilling example. She was taken during the infamous raid on Parker Ford in Texas in 1836 while pregnant. Throughout her captivity, Rachel was beaten mercilessly, her skin constantly raw and bruised. After giving birth, her baby was killed, an act of cold pragmatism, as the child was seen as a hindrance to her work. The abuse pushed Rachel to the brink, and she often contemplated death as an escape from her torment. In one instance, she defied a Comanche woman, who ordered her to fetch a tool for digging roots. Rachel refused, hoping the confrontation would lead to her death. The woman attacked her, pushing her to the ground, but Rachel survived in one particular incident. Rachel found herself locked in a brutal, primal fight with another Comanche woman. Surrounded by a ring of men who cheered and howled, the two women scratched, bit, and grappled on the ground. Rachel, in a moment of sheer desperation, managed to grab a bloody buffalo bone and stood over the woman, stunned that she was still alive. She couldn't fathom why the men, who watched with such indifference, didn't intervene. Not to save her or even the other woman. They simply didn't care. The fight concluded, and the men dispersed as if nothing had happened, leaving Rachel confused but relieved. But her ordeal was far from over. An older woman, clearly insulted by Rachel's earlier altercation, decided to assert her authority. She demanded Rachel gather straw for a fire, intending to burn her alive. But by now Rachel had found a new will to live, and once again refused. This sparked yet another savage battle. With the flames from the fire, they had started burning them both as the older woman tried to force Rachel into the blaze. Amused by the spectacle, the men continued to watch but did nothing to intervene. As the fight raged on, the women broke one of the lodge poles, holding up a teepee. Rachel, despite being injured, once again emerged victorious. The next morning, she was summoned to the men's council house, expecting some form of punishment. To her surprise, they only asked her to repair the lodgepole she had broken during the fight. Her one condition: that the older woman who had attacked her assist in fixing it. The whole situation left Rachel baffled. What Rachel didn't understand at the time was that these fights among the women were a form of establishing hierarchy. Unlike the men who focused on hunting, war, and tribal matters, the women had their own social structure, and disputes often played out in these physical confrontations. The men, uninterested in the women's internal struggles, allowed these fights to happen naturally, sometimes even for their own amusement, but in some cases, these fights actually led to improved relationships. After Rachel's first fight, she surprisingly washed the face of the woman she had beaten. From that point on, the woman became unusually friendly toward her, illustrating how these customs solidified boundaries and respect among the women. This system of hierarchy among Comanche women reveals a side of their culture that is often overshadowed by the men's dominance. In warfare, these women, though seemingly subjugated, were fierce and independent in their own way. However, Rachel's case was different from many other captives. She was a slave to the tribe, valued for her labor, and meant to be ransomed eventually. Her life, though harsh, had some worth in the eyes of the Comanche. But not all captives were treated this way, and many, especially those who didn't serve a purpose, faced a much darker fate in 1840. Tensions between the Comanche and Texans reached a boiling point when Texan soldiers attacked a group of Panataka Comanche, killing dozens during what was supposed to be a peaceful council meeting. The Texans had demanded that the Comanche return their white captives, but when the captives didn't appear, violence erupted to the Comanche. This attack was a betrayal beyond words. After learning that their leaders had been slain, the warriors cut off portions of their sacred long hair in a display of deep grief. Yet it was the women who expressed their sorrow in a far more disturbing manner. Comanche women entered into a frenzied state of mourning, wailing and cutting themselves across their arms, legs, and even breasts. Booker Webster, a young boy who had been taken captive by the Comanche, later recalled witnessing women go to even more extreme lengths. Some chopped off their fingers, while others mutilated themselves so severely that they died from their injuries. But once their mourning turned to fury, the women directed their anger toward the remaining white captives as the Comanche men prepared for war. It was the women who were left to exact vengeance on the prisoners. They carried out horrifying acts of torture on their captives, both adults and children alike, mutilating their bodies, cutting and skinning them before burning them alive. Some of these executions lasted for hours, others for days. To the Comanche women, this wasn't just about revenge, it was a cultural practice. Mutilating the enemy was a way of ensuring that their souls would be damaged in the afterlife. In the Comanche worldview, their true tribal name, the Ni, meant the people and only they were considered worthy of existence. All others were outsiders, destined to suffer the consequences if captured. This grim ritual was seen as an expected part of life. On the plains, if the roles were reversed, the Comanche women fully expected to meet the same fate. While the men fought swiftly on the battlefield, it was in the safety of the camp that the women had the time and freedom to unleash their wrath upon their enemies. They relished these acts and even took trophies, just as the men did on their raids. For settlers on the frontier, the thought of being captured by the Comanche was terrifying, but being taken alive to their camp was often considered a fate worse than death. Those who knew the customs understood that the real horror awaited them at the hands of the women, who were just as brutal, if not more so, than the men. The frontier was a place of constant fear, where survival often meant avoiding capture at all costs.